Good afternoon. My name is Camille Llanes-Fontanilla, and I'm the Executive Director of SOMOS Mayfair, a grassroots organization in East San Jose, a neighborhood that is facing displacement and gentrification like many neighborhoods here in the Bay Area. We've learned that only 5% of Bay Area neighborhoods are affordable enough for people who make $15 an hour. Most of these people are low-income people of color, and they are finding it difficult to stay here as each day goes on. As the lead partner to the City of San Jose for the Bay's Future Challenge Grant, I was surprised when we were asked to deliver this closing because we are not an expert in the housing realm. However, we are really good at building relationships with community, forming true partnerships, uplifting the voice of the people who are most affected by the lack of housing and education and economic opportunity. And we create spaces where they can uplift their voices and challenge leadership so that we can get to systemic change that is meaningful to them. And we also know how to ground ourselves in root causes, understanding the issues we face and being mindful of not creating more harm in communities and perpetuating systemic inequities. So the opportunity of the Bay's future is hopeful. It's important for all of us, partners, philanthropists, city officials, to see this work and its immense opportunity, to center ourselves on the demands of equity, racial equity, and solutions that radically change the way things are done. We have to change the paradigm. We can no longer be about capital or wealth generation for a few. We can no longer be about moving up and moving out, but rather, how do we center ourselves on being rooted in a home and having a permanent place to live and work? The Bay's future includes critical policy work in collaboration with community residents and city leaders. And while it's important and we must continue to champion affordable housing, especially for our low-income, extremely low-income households, we know with a recent example with our partners at Resources for Community Development that the need outweighs the amount of housing that's available. Just recently, 2,800 people applied for 30 units of extremely low-income housing. Only 1% of the applicants will be able to be housed. We need to figure out a way to build more, but also protect and preserve the affordability we have. This is also an opportunity for us to build new models of housing, where we shift power and resources back to the Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous communities that have long gone without. And as grantees, partners, and practitioners, we are doing this work. We need to allow ourselves to not fall back into the same patterns of superficial change. We cannot champion equality for all instead of true equity, and we cannot become paralyzed by process and analysis. We must act boldly and urgently with conviction and acknowledge the historical context of racism, violence, oppression, and exclusion that have allowed for wealth accumulation in this region for generations. I also want to talk about the pandemic. This year has been painful beyond measure. Our neighborhood and the surrounding zip codes have had the highest rates of coronavirus and deaths in Santa Clara County. We have lost neighbors, including community residents, organizers who've worked alongside us championing affordable housing. And we have lost young people to depression and isolation from this pandemic. From our partners at Destination Home and Sacred Heart Community Services and the 68 organizations that distributed $36 million to 15,000 households during this pandemic, we know that the vast majority are people of color. 94%. We know that 77% are from extremely low-income households. And we know that 68% of these households have children. We also know that a third of this money went to 5 zip codes in East San Jose, the very zip codes that SOMOS does work in. We also know from the Bay Area Council's Economic Institute that it is our people, low-wage workers, full-time workers who are still below the poverty level, workers without high school diplomas, renter households, cost-burdened renter households, mobile homes, people who are born in other countries, people who speak other languages other than English, and single-parent households. These are our people, and these are the people who are going to have the most difficult time recovering from this pandemic. They are most vulnerable to the displacement from a natural disaster, and in this case, a global pandemic. But we know that this isn't new. We know that the fractures that we are seeing from this pandemic are tied directly to the Bay Area's history of racial exclusion in housing. We've known these truths for far too long, but this virus has erupted the systemic fractures in our society for all of us to see. And we must not turn a blind eye and champion for things that turn us back to being normal, because for far too many, normal has been dangerous and dehumanizing. I am proud to call the Bay Area home. It is home to many social justice movements that have paved the way for workers' rights, women's rights, and rights for the LGBTQIA community. And these movements and their progress have given the Bay Area a global reputation of progressivism and equality. But we cannot turn away from our history of exclusion and land dispossession. Our region's present-day displacement and massive inequalities are noted by the Haas Institute, saying that the people who've owned land, the people who have had access to financing, and the people who have held political power have all determined who gets to call the Bay Area home. And the writers of this piece assert, and I wholeheartedly agree with them, that if we do not confront and reconcile this history, we cannot advance an equitable and thriving Bay Area that many of us envision. We must acknowledge the initial colonization of the Bay Area and the violence against Indigenous people originally on these lands, the militias during the Gold Rush era, the removal of Chinese and Mexican Americans from their neighborhoods, and the anti-Black violence, arson, and urban renewal that has exploited labor and segregated housing, and the exclusive single-family rezoning that has kept too many people in redline communities and others with immense amount of wealth. We can't ignore the disinvestment, the discriminatory lending practices, as all of this is part of our history. It's insidious in all of our systems, and it's still prevalent today in the name of capitalism and wealth accumulation. It's the root of the aggressive gentrification, the global land displacement, and the local narratives and politics, where the type of housing, but really it's the people that we are constantly saying we don't want in our neighborhoods. We have to center ourselves in these histories, and we also have to understand how these histories affect the reality of the people living here today. The reality of your neighbors, your childcare providers, your food vendors. We need to understand the short-term and long-term implications of the housing conditions that the people of this Bay Area are facing because of their living conditions. For example, think about the father who's working 2 to 3 jobs, and the mental health impacts that has on him and his family, his children who rarely get to see him. Think about the children who are living in hallways and couches, who are being told by their teachers right now that they need a quiet place to study. Or the single mother who has been assaulted by her landlord, but she stays because she needs a roof over her head and her children's head. We also know a mother and a son who were evicted in the middle of a storm this winter with no place to go because the rent moratorium did not protect them. These are the challenges that we're facing, our neighbors are facing, and unless we understand the root causes and their pain, we will not be able to forge a stronger vision, a more vibrant vision for the Bay Area forward. So what do we do at SOMOS? We stay inspired and hopeful. We seek to build community power, and I know many people in this region are doing similar work. We are all working together to secure land for our people so that they no longer have to live in fear. We want to convene people, uplift their voices, bring art and joy like the videos we saw from the Black Cultural Zone in Oakland, the work that's happening in East Palo Alto, and the work that's happening in East San Jose. This is the stuff that brings us joy, watching people come together to champion solutions that will be meaningful to them and their families, and to do it with joy, music, song, and dance. What we need from philanthropy, from city leaders, and from practitioners is often to get out of the way, to let people build solutions for themselves, and to work together as one ecosystem rather than disparate organizations and initiatives. We should be sharing knowledge and expertise. We should be convening various bodies of philanthropy together, rather than forcing nonprofits and community members to seek funding and relationships with individual funders and build resources little by little over time. And we cannot just say that we're about equity. Again, we must center ourselves on equity, find solutions that are tangible, that are meaningful to the people of color, and let them lead the way. We don't just need representation, we need real power, decision-making in the hands of the people who are most impacted by the housing insecurity. We need the redistribution of wealth and reparations to correct the horrific past that we just talked about. What we really need is liberation.